from Free. Thanks for joining us today. If you do need crisis support, 13 11 14. The kids helpline also 1800 55 1800. The topics that we're covering today are quite heavy, so please do seek help if you need it, because it is brave to talk, it's important to talk, and it's vital that you seek help when you need it. We are talking today, of course, about this 10-year-old boy who took his own life in state government care. I don't know how many times I can reiterate that point. He was in state care and he's taken his own life. It's absolutely awful. And joining us now is Jerry Giajatis. He is representing the family of this 10-year-old boy. Jerry, good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us today, mate.
Hi, Isaac. Myself and Megan Cracker and others are supporting the family as best we can.
Yeah, it's such an awful, awful time for them. Can I start by asking, how is the family holding up in such tragic circumstances?
Well, they're not holding up well. They're distraught. There's a number of siblings, and they're distraught. The parents have lost a 10-year-old, and no one expects to lose a child so young, and the circumstances that is suspected as to how this child was lost was a suspected suicide, and police and the coroner's office have said as much.
Yeah.
But they're holding up poorly.
Yeah.
They're suffering, and that's it to be expected.
Yeah.
What we're doing is mentoring, spreading the love, and allowing for the grief, because you've got to grieve. You've got to grieve and grieve and grieve, and eventually start soaking it up and be careful not to drown in it.
Yeah, exactly. Great point, and very well put. And it's such a heartbreaking story to talk about, but it's really important that we have this discussion. You're someone who is, I guess, an expert in this field, and you know what needs to change. In fact, you've been saying for years and years what needs to change and how to do it. No one seems to have listened to you. The Liberals yesterday, they pledged if they get government next year that they would separate the Department of Child Protection. They'd remove that from the Department of Communities. Is that a good first step to fixing this problem? I know there's more steps than that, but is that a good first one?
Well, the fact is that we've been there where this department has been standalone. The fact is that it was diabolically problematic, in my opinion, with the high rates of removals of non-First Nations and First Nations. And in terms of comparative countries of our social and emotional quotient and economic wealth, and especially in Western settings, we have just about the highest rates of removals of children from their biological families of all children removed, First Nations and non-First Nations. And of course, as we all sadly know, tragically know, the rates of removals of First Nations children from their biological families are horrific rates, 10, 11, 12, 13 times that of non-First Nations. But there are 50,000 children thereabouts removed, and almost half of them are First Nations children. They're just horrific rates of removal. It shouldn't be happening. The intensive support on family support doesn't happen to the extent that it should have. It should be family oriented, but I see an overreactivity and an over-involvement of the department, and not just in this jurisdiction of Western Australia, but right throughout this country, in families and separating families far too prematurely. Some have to be taken into custody and care and supported, but we have children that are taken into care and custody that we've been able to reunify, myself and my colleagues, nearly 100% of the time, and that speaks of why hadn't the department done that? Why hadn't the caseworkers done that? Why haven't the people that are being funded so richly $1 billion in this state, $7 billion Australia-wide, approaching $8 billion in funding for what we call Department of Child Protection as part of communities here in WA, and what they call in the Northern Territory Families, what they call in New South Wales Family Services, and but their child protection, and they're removed at horrific rates. And the supports don't happen. Less than 20% of the budget that I've described, the $8 billion budget Australia-wide and the $1 billion budget in Western Australia, well, actually 17% is spent on 17% is spent on family support. and the rest there's no wages and operational, and about 14% in Western Australia on family supports. That's pittance. What we need to do is recalibrate. At least 40-50% of the budget should be spent on family support, keeping families together, and helping them to be apart, those that are removed, for as short a period as possible, because the longer we keep families apart, identity becomes a liability through the disconnection and dissonance and the separation, and it's a situational trauma that becomes compounding and cumulative and can sometimes become irreparable and damage families enormously in that very vital form and content period of ages, particularly through 7, 8 years of age to 15, 16. It's a volatile period where you need families supported together.
Yeah.
But I've seen too many people removed for things that they troubled waters that in general many of us have and we can navigate, and because they come to the attention of the department, everything is now the reaction is in the interest of the child instead of stronger families, and we're removing far too prematurely. But the evidence is the diabolical rates of removal for all children, First Nations and non-First Nations, and the class is narrow because most of them come from the lowest quintile of income base, and there's nothing restorative that we're doing for them. We're arguing that we've got to protect their best interests and we've got to be safe rather than sorry, when that's an outlier, the safe rather than sorry stuff. And we've got to work with the majority of these young ones to support them with their families, support the families through troubled water and aberrance, and not remove them. I'd say 2/3 should never have been removed. That's my experience and my presumption. And I won't call myself an expert, but I have a lot of experientialism, been on a lot of safety plans, been able to reunify families and stabilise them. And that should have been the work of the departments, not the work of individual advocates or small services like ourselves. In terms of this child, it's the youngest death in child protection custody that I'm aware of, and actually, in fact, I'm 100% sure that it is the youngest death or suicide of a child in child protection custody in any form of out-of-home care settings. Yeah, and the youngest suicide death in this country recorded, which I also responded to, is of a 9-year-old. Actually, in fact, 3 9-year-olds between 2012, one in 1998 in Broome, one in remote South Australia in 2012, and another one in regional Queensland in 2017, to which I spent 5 days with the family in loss and group support. So I responded to the youngest suicide in this country, and I responded to a lot of the very young suicides that have occurred. But I've also, there wasn't an echo of suicidality in all the ones we supported. We were actually able to stabilise families and potential fears for young ones, particularly in impoverished families. We supported away from suicidality. Yeah. And since that period of time in post-prevention, I worked in prevention. I worked with hundreds in post-prevention and helped stabilise them. I worked with thousands in prevention. And even though I'm retired now, I didn't lose anyone. And that's not because of miracle work. That's because we were there. Yeah. We were there relentlessly, putting support.
And I think that's the big thing, Jerry, is that you were there. And I do question, because I've been reading today that child protection workers are saying that what's going on in that section of the Department of Communities is abominable, as you commented yesterday. In 2016, we heard that a 10-year-old girl took her own life. At the time, a Labor senator said that it should be a wake-up call for the state government. That was Pat Dodson. Has that happened? It clearly hasn't, because we're seeing another 10-year-old child taking their own life, this time in state care. So the government have ignored the wake-up calls. I spoke to a lady in Karratha last week who lost her son in different circumstances, I know, but to suicide. And she asked me, how many suicides will it take for the government to act? So let me ask you the same question, because you've worked in this space a lot longer, and you've talked about it a lot longer than I have. How many suicides will it take for the government to actually do something about this?
That 10-year-old in Luma in the Kimberley, I was the person who brought it to the attention of the nation. And, I can't talk to all the specifics because
of course.
There's sensitivities involved. She had lost a sister to suicide too, and her first cousin to suicide that she walked in and found her. So there's a lot of tragedy. Like I said, the youngest ones I've worked with, and I've taken a lot of lived experience out into the media so we can actually have discussion. I don't encourage or discourage people to talk to the media, but the lens of the media is imperative because it answers your question about how do we get our governments, who are the only ones who are sovereign over the context of systemic change, to make a difference, and make the difference that should be in this powerfully wealthy nation by comparison to other nations around the world's fourth largest economy. But they don't listen. How many lives will it take? I've asked that question many, many times. I've woken up in the middle of the night, and my wife's woken up and found me over the decades to be looking at the ceiling, looking at the walls, and asking me what I'm thinking, till eventually she always knew what I was thinking. I had children on my mind that took their lives unexpectedly, or because of psychological injury, because a lot of what we go through in this life for many is psychologically injurious, because of emotional battering, because of deprivation, of acute poverty, because of all sorts of situational trauma, which we don't need to go into. And what takes a life as young as 9? What takes a life as young as 10 or 11? What takes a life of a 30-year-old with 6 or 7 kids? What takes a life of someone who ran into a house, and a 19-year-old boy who never leaves my mind ran into a house, and when it was burning, fire, and the whole place was about to collapse, and he rescued a mother and 2 babies. And the next day he took his life because of the psychologically injurious things that he'd experienced in his life. I think of all sorts of people, and I've given up thinking about governments making a difference. It's the Bob Dylan song, Blowing in the Wind. How many cannonballs fly over before we no longer fire, before there's no more wars?
Yeah.
How many cannonballs? How many lives will it take? How many cannonballs will it take? Well, we see that warmongering, the wickedness of that just goes on. We see that we pay no attention to conciliation, amelioration, the spreading of love, living as neighbours and brothers and sisters. And we accept suicides. That's what I've come to understand. We're horrified and shocked by it, and especially when one's so young, because we weren't put on this earth presumably to bury our children, and we weren't put on this earth to betray them either, but we do betray them. Institutional settings have betrayed them. Authorities have covered up for all sorts of wickedness. So in the end, I'm part of those people that actually ask, is the world capable of compassion? Are we geared in the right direction? How is it possible that we can talk all this love and all this kindness and all this compassion and yet be so wicked and ruthless in our decision-making, prioritise the top end of town and not prioritise the impoverished, the homeless, the transient, those who have been afflicted by all sorts of trauma? And yet, and where we talk about institutions of the state covering up sexual abuse for decades, for a century in effect, for eons. We also have, by censorship, by omission, governments who put out public relation exercise and say, well, this is functioning well, and this bastion of this instrument of the state is functioning well, and it does things out of what is best fit for young or older, or for whatever they're about in pursuit of humanity. But we see all this inhumanity, we see this brutality, we see all this surplus, all this lording of surplus budgets, of wealth, of assets, and we don't actually want to spend on the poorest amongst us. We don't take a triage-based approach. We say we have a trickle-down economy. I say it dries up long before it can trickle down to the poorest, to the lowest quintile of income base, the lowest fifth of income.
Yeah.
We people poor. We say we will leave no one behind, but we do leave people behind, and we hold them back.
Yeah.
And we treat them as downtrodden. We say that, the poor will always be with us. And in effect, we're saying this suicidality will always be with us, and then we'll lose children too. And that's just the way it is. Because that's the way we act. That's who we are.
Yeah.
So it breaks my heart when a 9-year-old takes their life, when a 10-year-old takes their life. It breaks my heart when a 6-year-old attempts, when a 7-year-old attempts, when an 8-year-old attempts, because each of those ages I've supported someone who attempted to take their life.
Yeah, Jerry, look, Jerry, I completely agree with you, and what you're saying, I completely 100% agree with, and there's so much pain inflicted on the vulnerable members of our society, particularly First Nations people who are disproportionately affected by this, which is outrageous in itself. Look, I do have to go because I do have to clear a commitment, but Jerry, mate, it's an awful situation. Please pass my love and my listeners' love to the family. We'll talk again, I'm sure, in the next few days and chat more about how we can fix this. But thank you for your bravery. Thanks for being so raw, honest and emotional with us today. I got a text from a listener here saying, I can really hear the emotion in Jerry's voice. We really appreciate you, mate. We really appreciate what you're doing and how you're standing up for people. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate you, Isaac, your listeners, the people who are texting in, and your whole station. You're a masthead of change. You're a masthead of love. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, mate. I appreciate that. That's Jerry Tejantis joining us today. He's an advocate, but he's also a fighter, and he's a man who just wants change. I mean, how hard is it to do that? I mean, we shouldn't be seeing a 10-year-old child taking their own life. I mean, we shouldn't. That shouldn't even be a thing in their head. Never mind actually actioning it. I mean, we've heard the devastating effect that the mental health crisis is having on people, young people especially, up in the Pilbara. But it's happening in our own neighbourhood. This young man resided in Perth. We're seeing it in our backyard. That's what's going on, people. That is what's going on. And I asked Libby Metzum, the leader of the WA Liberals, whether Amber Jade Sanderson should give up this mental health portfolio. I think she should. I think it's time she does so, because she is failing miserably. Whilst people continue to take their own lives due to the failure of our various systems, including in this case of this 10-year-old boy, the state child protection system, as long as that keeps failing kids and kids are dying, well, that's an indictment on her efforts. She needs to go. She needs to hand back this portfolio and hang her head in shame, because this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable that we have young kids taking their own lives whilst in the state's care. Not acceptable at all. And whilst this continues, we'll continue to be a voice for those kids who have tragically lost their life. And who could imagine what this young man could have done if he had a better shot at life? He could have done so many fantastic things, but here we are talking about his awful, awful death. It's 6 away from 3. Again, if you do need crisis support, 13 11 14. The Kids Helpline also 1-800 55 1800. It's 6 to 3. I'm Isaac Mulcrone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll take a break and we'll come back and play some Billie Eilish right after this. Don't go anywhere. It's Friday, the 19th of April, 2024. I'm Isaac Mulcrone.
Isaac would love to hear from you. DM us on our socials. Just search Youth Jam Online on Facebook, Instagram and TikTok.